Hey, everybody. It's been a while. So this is all fake back here. I've taken an Airbnb and it's got this like I don't know, picture or something with all this fancy stuff. But anywho, so I wanted to jump on because w- watched a movie this weekend, Sinners, which I'm assuming a lot of you have heard of. It sounds like it's doing pretty well in the box office and pretty popular. And it's really one of the best movies I've seen in a while. And the reason I like it so much is I think it's an INFJ movie for INFJs, and I'll explain why I think that in a minute here. And we INFJs so rarely get um, any movies or main characters or anything. We're usually sort of the side characters, the side plot. We just sort of help things go along. We're the Yodas, the wizards, helping out the main character on their quest or their journey. But every once in a while, you'll get a movie where it's the INFJ-ness is the point of the movie. Um, so let's talk about it. And of course, if you haven't seen the movie, Sinners, I would recommend watching it first before you watch this video because I'm going to spoil the whole thing. And there are a lot of spoilers in it. And I think you would just get a lot more out of it by watching it first and then, listening to my whole spiel on it later. Because I don't want to give anything away. And I also don't want to ruin the way that you watch it or, receive it. Okay, so for those of you who haven't seen it and want to see it, go watch it. It's streaming now on Prime. I think you have to rent it, but nevertheless, you can watch it and then come back. Okay, so but those of you who have seen it or aren't planning on watching it and don't care if you're spoiled, then here's my spiel. So it starts off right away. It's an INFJ movie because it starts off with this narration about how there are certain people in the world that across cultures um, who are so good at music, at playing music, that they sort of summon the elders of the past and people from the future. And it's this sort of idea that your music is so good, it sort of crosses the threshold of time and space, right? Sort of messing with that cosmic frequency and creating, you know, God knows what in the space time continuum, right? And they talk about how in Ireland they were called the Philly. They refer to it as the Phillies. Um, we'll get back to that in a second. You might have heard of in Irish, it's either the Phils or the Phillies. And then they had a name for it in a Native American culture, and then a name for it in West African culture. I think Griot was the African name. But the point being that different cultures had these different people, these different artists who could, break this space time continuum because they were so good at playing music, right? And so right away, we have this INFJ theme. And if you think of the INFJ as the conduit between the metaphysical world and the physical world, then that's a manifestation of it or an example of it, right? And so let's unpack that a little because this might be the first time you're sort of hearing this, especially from me. But one of the things that if you sort of take a Jungian approach and not so much a neuroscience approach, but a very Jungian approach, one of the things about lead intuitives that he thought was that they have this access to the intuitive world, the metaphysical world, that, your normal quote unquote person just doesn't have. And they're able to sort of dig into this metaphysical world and see things before they happen. And it's the idea of kind of seeing around corners. But he was a little bit more dramatic about it, of like, you just sort of you sort of assume things are going to sort of unroll or unravel um, over time, but you know it before it happens, and then you're surprised that nobody else knows that it hadn't happened yet, right? So, for example, your intuition is telling you that that two people out of your friend group have started dating, but they haven't told anybody yet, right? So it's a big secret, to them, but the INFJ knows, right? The INFJ just can tell right away, if they know the people well enough, and are sort of tuned into the cues, and then they're sort of surprised that nobody else knows, right? Or nobody else has sort of figured it out or realized it, right? And so you might blurt something out, sort of unknowingly, not realizing that this is all a big secret and nobody's supposed to know, because and you just sort of assume everybody else knows, right? That's kind of a classic example, but you can imagine a lot of other things, right? Like in the business setting, you just know that somebody's is going to be made partner or something. Nobody told you that that this person's going to be partner, but all the puzzle pieces and all the clues sort of, point to that side, right? And so you just sort of naturally, there have been times in my career where, somebody was still an associate and I thought they were a partner, and I'm referring to them as a partner and they're not yet. And I was just like, oh, okay, well, you're clearly going to be a partner in the next year or two. And you just sort of lose sight of the fact that, you're sort of putting the puzzle pieces together, a lot quicker than it's actually unfolded, right? Okay, so Jung had that sort of impression about lead intuitives, and I know that a lot of people think Jung himself was a lead intuitive, and maybe he was. There's a debate out there about it, but he certainly had his opinion about lead intuitives and how they were sort of, able to cobble together things in the metaphysical world and see things before they actually happened in the physical world, just by sort of piecing together, these patterns or whatever. And and I don't think you have to be too woo-woo or new age about it to appreciate the fact that some people are probably just good at reading a situation and reading the cues and figuring out, okay, this is sort of, 80% to 90% gonna happen, right? Um, but especially if you're sort of immersed in the situation. So I'm not trying to say that you could take an INFJ or an INTJ and stick them in a room and they're going to figure out, who's going to win the Super Bowl or who's going to win all the, baseball games or anything. To me, it's not that kind of predictive value, but there's some predictive value that's going on, with the ability to just sort of read the situation. Okay. And then on top of that, so on top of the ability to sort of read into the intuitive world or the internal metaphysical world, where all the archetypes and all the symbols and all that stuff live, there's also this idea that the lead intuitives, and I would argue especially the INFJ, are the ones who sort of bridge the gap between the metaphysical world and the physical world, right? Because we've got the lead NI and then that fourth function SE, which is sort of getting things out into the world, right? Applying our force into the physical world, and somewhere in the black box, we're able to take the information that we're gleaning, or extracting out of the metaphysical world and translating it into the physical world. Okay. And so in literature and, you know, just stories, um, or, fictional stories, that is, those are the INFJs. Those are the people who have this sort of deep historical knowledge about their culture, about, the people in the culture, the rules, the norms, the traditions, the art, the music, things that make culture culture. They have that knowledge, because all those things are what are binding the culture and the people within the culture together, right? It's the glue that binds the people together. And of course, my big underlying theory here is that like every personality type sort of serves a different function within the culture. And the INFJs, and I would argue the INTJs to some extent, serve as the knowledge base, right? We are the knowers. We are the knowers of the culture. And it seems a little funny to think about today with, the fact that we, have the entire culture on Google, the entire history of our society, at our fingertips on a computer. But you have to, realize that that's a very, very new phenomenon. And, for thousands of years through all the cultures out there, there had to be somebody or a group of somebodies who understood and knew the culture, and was able to share it with, the new members, right? The children, and then the young adults, and then even the other adults, right, who might need a lesson or two of how things are done. And the example I like to use are the Brehons in Ireland, which are sort of an extension of the Druids. You've probably heard of the Druids, and they're usually thought of as like sort of the precursor of like Merlin or the wizards or Gandalf the Grey. They walk around with the pointy hats and do, little magic tricks with herbs and stuff and healing and all that. But the Brehons were sort of an offshoot of that, where they were, basically the lawyers in ancient Ireland, where if somebody had a dispute, within the town, they'd go to this Breton and they would sort of figure out the solution to the dispute, just like a judge would, today. And the idea was is that these guys, these Bretons, I think they were all men. I could be wrong about that. There might have been some female, but they had been trained from a very early age, in history and poetics and art and aesthetics and all of the sort of liberal arts that we think of, and learned the laws of the culture and the norms. And they didn't really have a sophisticated writing system where they could write all this stuff down. So it was all done through oral tradition. And so you could imagine you need, a certain subset of the population who just gets that, right? Who's just very good at a cognitive function level of understanding culture, understanding people, understanding how all this culture stuff sort of binds the people together. And I'm not going to say that like every Breton was an INFJ, because you just probably didn't have enough INFJs to do it. But the really good ones were probably INFJs. And, the INFJs were probably the ones who sort of ran the system. And it was funny. They also had this sort of like hierarchy where the better you did as a Breton, like the more you got paid and things like that. So there was this, competitive network in it. And so I could imagine the INFJs and probably the INTJs did really well. And so they had to come up with solutions to, disputes where, somebody stole somebody's cow or somebody sold a cow and the cow was no good and they want their money back and all that kind of stuff. So they would try to come up with solutions that sort of fit their society, that fit their culture, and try to make everything fair. And you can imagine a bunch of drunk Irish people getting mad at each other. You got to have some sort of calming influence, or it's just going to be a madhouse everywhere, right? And so that's what the Brits did. And so they had a real, so they were not only good at figuring out like what's fair, and what's equitable in the situation, but also just how it ties to the culture. And there's a lot of examples of that, that you can probably find online where, they, whatever the solution was, it had to be something that, advanced their culture. And it was usually sort of, they would try to use an analogy to nature, right? Like this is the way nature would solve it. And so we're going to solve it that way. They were very in tune with nature, very tied to the natural world. Okay. And so again, another very INFJ thing, right? And so if you think about it, they, at a very sort of fundamental level, they were using their knowledge about the metaphysical world, abstract concepts and ideas about culture and, the way that things work in their culture, the way that people are bound together, and applied it in the real world, right? In the real physical world with real physical world problems, right? This guy sold me a defective cow defective cow, and we got to figure out a solution to that, right? And it can't just be in the abstract, right? We have the rubber actually hits the road and we have to figure out how to solve this problem. And so that's not, as exciting and as woo-woo or new age as you might think. When you talk about taking stuff from the metaphysical world and applying it into the physical world, but it certainly is an example of it, right? Even if it's a less sexy example than like Merlin doing some sort of magic trick, right? Where he's either an INTJ or an INFJ, doing his magic, or Yoda, that kind of thing. But it's the same concept, right? But at a more, more fantastical or mystical level. And in stories, like they're trying to put that idea out there, that concept out there of transcending the metaphysical world and being a conduit into the physical world, but they like to talk, but most people think of that as magic, right? So I can say these words that, are a metaphysical thing and have some sort of abstract idea and manifest something in the physical world, like bring some demon, out, into the world, or, or in Harry Potter, light a candle, where, I'm taking a metaphysical concept, just words, and I'm casting this spell into the world and having actual physical results from my words, the true meaning of performative language, right? Where your language actually creates something in the world, in the physical world. But that's all fictional archetype, collective, universal, collective unconscious, that kind of stuff, where it resonates with us, right? That there's this ability to bridge the gap between the metaphysical and the physical world. But it happens in maybe less sexy ways, like, the law or physics, like coming up with a physical equation and then figuring out how to turn that into a rocket ship, right? That's what your INTJs are there for, right? They're bridging the gap between the mathematical abstraction of physics and math and all that stuff, and coming up with rocket ships, right? That actually, manifest themselves. And that's, when you hear about technology basically, or, technology basically being the magic of, you know, previous generations, right? So if a previous people living 200 years ago saw our technology, they would think it was magic, right? That we were somehow conjuring up metaphysical things into the physical world by casting these crazy spells. But really, all we're doing is understanding the abstract um, nature of forces and electromagnetism and all that fun stuff, and translating that into physical stuff, technology, right? So the INTJs get the credit for that. The INFJs get the credit for the social cohesion, right? The you know, there's concepts of justice and equity in contract law and property law and ownership rights and negative rights and positive rights and all that kind of stuff you learn in law school and civics classes has to be translated into the real world, right? I mean, how do we actually run a society that, knock on wood, follows all these convoluted rules, and what are the best rules, and which rules should we apply and in which situations and what should we avoid, all that kind of stuff. And that's the INFJ stuff. So let's go back to sinners, because now you get my background on what I think the INTJs and the INFJs are doing is serving as these conduits, and the sort of the source of the knowledge, right? So not only do you have to be able to sort of bridge that gap, but you also have to be able to you have to be a knower. You have to retain that information and be able to learn it in all of its abstractions. And INFJs and INTJs are very, very good at that stuff because they're lead intuitives. And so in Sinners, you start off right off the bat talking about these people in various cultures who bridge that gap, from the arguably the metaphysical world to the physical world. Now it's a little tricky because they're talking about bringing back the people from lost generations or people even from future generations, and sort of bending time and space in this way. And so maybe it's more of an SP thing, the people who are actually doing it, maybe they're just really good at sort of exerting their force and controlling the physical world. And so I'll give them that. The main character, Sammy, or one of the main characters, who's the guitar player and singer, who ultimately is sort of an example of one of these people. You could argue he's an SP, or you could argue he's an NF. Either way, I think it works. But there certainly are a lot of INFJs or NF types surrounding him who understand what his power is or what his capability is. And one good example is Smoke's wife or girlfriend, the one he had. Again, spoiler here, that he had I think a daughter with who had passed away or something, but she's and she was like lives in a shed and puts together these root and herbal concoctions to protect him while he's in Chicago, and all this kind of very INFJ, kind of witchy stuff. Again, manifesting ideas, concepts into the physical world, but here we're talking about actual magic, right? In the story, at least. And so she's clearly an INFJ. She clearly has the knowledge base of how all this stuff works and how these people work and what's going on with the Sammy character, and then also what's going on with a lot of the other characters, and how that's all supposed to sort of shake out and be handled. And so she's a good example. And so if you're ever trying to figure out like who's the INFJ character in a movie, it's the one that has the knowledge. It's the one that people go to try to figure out like how does this cultural thing work, right? Or who does what in the culture, and they have some sort of book or something where they can say, oh yeah, this, or it just comes off the top of their head, years and years ago, this is what our forefathers did. So think of Yoda, think of the little monkey guy in The Lion King. To some extent, Obi-Wan Kenobi, but he's a little too involved in the action. The first movie, New Hope, he was more of an INFJ type character, but then, in all the other movies, he's more, sort of the action hero and not so much the INFJ guy. But the type, right? When you see it, those are the INFJs. And it's not the pretty girl next door, girl from next door, like Pam from The Office, or people like that typically are called INFJs and all the personality websites, because there's just this automatic reaction to just like find pretty quiet next door, girl next door types and call them INFJs. You see it with Stanata all the time, though she's an ESTP. And you see it with a lot of these characters, where if they're sort of introverted and pretty and somewhat smart, they'll call it the INFJ. And maybe that's true, but most likely not, unless people are going to them and trying to find out deep philosophical answers about their culture, they're probably not an INFJ, because the INFJ's role is to be the knower. And people go to the knower when they need to learn stuff. So again, you got to think of Yoda, you got to think of little monkey guy from The Lion King. Those are your classic examples. Okay. And in Sinners, I mean, he's just surrounded by all these people. The Delroy Lindo character, maybe is arguably an INFJ. I'm not going to call everybody an INFJ, but it was a very INFJ spirit surrounding the entire movie, or sort of percolating through the entire movie, because it was all about just trying to tie this metaphysical, spiritual thing into the physical world. And then when you're introduced to the main bad guys, and again, big spoiler here, but when the Irish people show up, they're looking for, again, they have this in their tradition. Again, they call them the Phillies. And that was another word for the Brehons. Like the students who ultimately became the Brehons were called the Phillies, or the Filidh. You don't pronounce the DH. To them, I think it was sort of a catch-all for just this group of people that were sort of like the Druids, the sort of wizard types in the Irish culture. Again, that ultimately became the Bretons. And so the Irish guys are looking for somebody with this power, because they knew about it from their culture, but just didn't happen to have anybody, or find anybody with it, So there's very much this chosen one kind of theme also running through, right? Where this young kid, this guitar player, singer from the plantation, is seen as sort of the chosen one, and all the cultures want him. They even sort of introduce a Native American culture. So you see these sort of ties, between everything. And arguably, you could say that, his singing sort of summoned the Irish people there. Now whether or not they were already there in physical form, or they just sort of, came across oceans of time and different dimensions, who knows? But he somehow summoned them there, and they clearly wanted to take him on as one of their own. And so there's this sort of existential battle between the two groups, but it also becomes this larger symbol of, the battle between cultures, and but also this weird way where the cultures are very similar, and so you can kind of see why both of them, sort of want the same thing, and they, they do it very, very well. It's not just black and white, good versus evil. It's culture sort of looking out for their own, but also, you know, maybe you could, help out other people. Who knows? But the other people were, going about it too, too nicely. Let's just say. Um, so, and the movie is just like full of symbolism, full of just visual symbolism, visual things that are going on that, any INFJ is going to pick up on and really appreciate and love. Um, and and it's just cool to see that the theme of the movie and really the plot, and all the characters are all sort of orbiting or circling around this INFJ like concept of bridging the gap between the metaphysical and the physical world, and sort of the cultural knowledge, of and sort of the idea of, like the Michael B. Jordan characters. He plays a set of twins in the movie. So the characters sort of represent this sort of like, you know, blindness to the culture. Like, they sort of got caught up in the here and now, and they talk about how they were working for the Capones in Chicago and sort of left behind the culture. And now they're coming back and trying to extort it and make money off of it. And they're quickly learning, through the movie that, you can't forget where you came from, right? Or you can't forget your culture, or it's going to catch up with you, in a very, sort of poignant way. So, and so there was also that, that theme running along as well, where the INFJ character or characters were trying to, get them to sort of realize like this is the way things are done in our culture. There were funny things about the money, how they opened up this juke joint and people wanted to pay with plantation money as opposed to U.S. money, and the Michael B. Jordan characters got all bent out of shape. They wanted U.S. money, but they're like, look, if you want these people to come in, you got to accept plantation money, and it, sort of put them sideways. But it also sort of taught them like, oh yeah, you gotta, if you're gonna be quote unquote making money off of these people, you gotta meet them halfway and use their money, right? So a lot of like symbolism, a lot of just like really good lesson, like deep, well thought out things going on that, don't really strike you at first. I mean, it really is sort of an action adventure movie in a lot of ways, but it's all about the conversations and the information that comes up out of these conversations. And another real interesting thing about the movie is like the character, like there's a lot of exposition where they're sort of explaining the characters and their background, but it happens throughout the movie.